Michaela Musilová is a Slovak astrobiologist, explorer, and the former director of High Seas, the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation Program. She has led simulated Mars and Moon missions in extreme environments, such as volcanic terrains and high altitude research sites, where scientists study how humans adapt to isolated and harsh conditions. Her work spans astrobiology, geology, and space mission simulations. Michaela has collaborated with researchers from NASA, the European Space Agency, and international science teams. But beyond her specific scientific work, Michaela is a dedicated advocate for women in STEM. She often speaks about the challenges she faced as a woman entering a male dominated field, especially coming from Slovakia, where opportunities in space science were limited. Her journey highlights resilience, creativity, and the belief that people from any background can contribute to space exploration. Welcome to Sweet 15, Michaela.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to chat with you. I have to say, I was initially super interested in chatting because you're originally from Slovakia and I'm Slovak too. So this means a lot to me to be able to sit down and chat with somebody who has a similar heritage and background. Because it is such a unique experience that I think because it's such a small country, we don't talk about enough. And so it's something that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about. As growing up in Slovakia, I want to know, how did that influence your dreams, especially in a field that doesn't have a big presence there?
Well, it had, I would say, multiple effects on my life. On one hand, I think a lot of people from Slovakia are very ambitious and driven. And I think, when we give ourselves a goal, we really try and go for it and do our best. But like the trade-off there is that, the reason many times we have to be like that or circumstances kind of make us be like that is because there aren't that many opportunities back home. At least they weren't when I was growing up. Because I was dreaming of doing space-related research since I was 8 years old. But even at that age, I knew that unfortunately I would eventually have to leave home to be able to pursue any kind of work in space or research in the future. But luckily that has changed, and nowadays there are many more opportunities in Slovakia, including multiple space companies. I think there's over 60 now that do space-related research, and I've done work for these companies. I've done teaching space-related subjects in Slovakia and things like that. So luckily things are changing, but I think in the past many of us, kind of felt like we had to leave to be able to work on some dreams. But I think it's really important that then we come back to some degree and give back so that others won't have to leave.
I love that. Yeah, it's a really powerful point. And I have to say, I feel like you probably were part of that reason that so many more space programs and research was being done in Slovakia. You were kind of one of the first. So that's congratulations and thank you
Thank you.
for that. But I want to know also, like being Eastern European, having that as your background, was there anything about our culture or values or upbringing that really shaped your mindset around that persistence and resilience that you needed for the work that you were going to do?
Now that I think about it, I think just having my parents and grandparents as role models was plenty in that way, because they're all such hardworking people. And for example, my parents, they're very passionate about what they do. My mom's an archaeologist. My father is a historian, writer, used to be a diplomat. And whatever they did, they just, did it fully and properly and tried their best. And no matter what obstacles got in their way, they were able to overcome them in some shape or form. And so they were really inspiring to me. And I think, that was very helpful for me to pursue a dream that seemed kind of impossible for someone from Slovakia. So I would say that is one big thing. And I think also in Slovakian culture, we're taught to value money and to be good at savings and all of that. Whereas I think from what I encountered abroad, it's not always the case. And so I think it's part of it, growing up maybe in a more modest environment in a country that just got out of socialism. Our values and view on the world is a little bit different. But I think those are all good things because by being able to save money well, I was able to get into universities in the UK and US and eventually to NASA, things that I wouldn't have been able to dream of before. And simply because I saved every single penny I could, and eventually that, amounted to something substantial that I could pay for rent for and things like that.
Yeah, and you touched on a really valid point, which is that you have these really big dreams, and sometimes it can feel really scary to people to take those steps towards those dreams, especially when finances and things like you have very accomplished people in your family, but at the same time, nobody was doing the things that you wanted to do, and so that can be really overwhelming. So I'm wondering what first drew you to astrobiology and extreme environments, and how did you take those baby steps forward until it eventually became a longer, more linear path that was actually feasible for you?
Thanks for asking. So it was, when I think back, at first it was just curiosity as a child. My parents took my brother and I into nature a lot for hikes, but both of them being very much involved with cultural things. We also went to a bunch of museums and things like that. And so I think my curiosity was encouraged as a child to ask questions, to wonder, why things work a certain way and all that. And that really helped me, I guess, become a scientist that early. So as a 7-year-old, I wanted to know everything about volcanoes. And a year later, I was in a supermarket waiting for my parents, bored, browsing through encyclopedia or something like that. And there was a chapter about planets Jupiter and Saturn and how they have moons and that there could be life on those moons. And for some reason, that just created this incredible spark in my mind. And I just wanted to know more. And more importantly, I wanted to work on that. I wanted to be a alien hunter to some degree. I basically, astrobiologist, but at the time, astrobiology didn't even really exist as a science that you could study somewhere. So I just called it space biology and really, really wanted to work on that. And, kind of like you said, my parents, though they were great in what they were doing, this was completely, literally alien to them. And so, as much as they, didn't discourage me from this passion, they just didn't know how to help me because their knowledge was in different areas. And financially, we were barely making ends meet in the family. And the place I grew up in was this building that was falling apart. And so, it wasn't great. And so I just knew from very early on that if I wanted to pursue this dream, I would have to do it alone, both in terms of, the knowledge I would have to gain and experiences, but also in terms of paying for everything. And so that was really hard. And it took me until my mid-teens to really decide, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Um, and I think what sparked that was in high school, we started learning a bit more about geology, and again, volcanoes came up, and I think that brought that, childhood passion and curiosity back into my life. I just remembered how much I loved volcanoes and space back when I was a kid. And so I decided, you know what? I'd rather work on something that I'm going to be, fascinated by, that I'm going to enjoy my whole life instead of doing something which I think most parents want us children, especially in Slovakia, is to get a job that pays well, which is understandable. Of course, they care about us, they want us to be happy. But I'm grateful that my parents, though they were concerned about me, knew that I would be happy doing something that I love, but that it was probably going to be a hard journey to get there.
Definitely. And I think it's so full circle and interesting that you've done work on humans in isolation. And at the same time, you knew this was going to be not an isolated path, but a path that was very singular and really based on you. So, how did you build community and like mentorship in this time? Or was that something that you were thinking about as you were making this journey?
Actually, kind of on the topic of isolating, I honestly, I had no idea how to do any of those things. I think to this day, I've never really had a mentor, and I wish I did. I really wish I had people in my life, outside of family and friends that could have given me guidance and help in the past. Sadly, I never really came across people like that, but there were good people in my life that help me in some shape or form, a professor that recommended a scholarship I should apply to, or, someone who wrote me a nice reference letter, things like that. But no one was there consistently for a longer period of time to really guide me. And so most of the time, it was really just me trying to create my own path in a a world that I knew very little about. And I was improvising most of the time. And I guess my way of thinking was I had my plans A, B, C, D, F, G. And I would always aim for plan A, but if it didn't work out, there were all those other backup plans to fall back on. And I think that really helped me because it allowed me to apply to work at NASA or to get a scholarship worth $50,000 to get into Caltech in the US, things that I would have never dreamed of before, but because I didn't limit myself to, no, I'm not good enough. Let me not even try that. That was really helpful. So I think I was just very brave and ambitious at the time just to see how it would go. Um, and but the community part was definitely important. I didn't really have community at first because, so to be able to get into space, I applied for universities abroad, so outside of Slovakia, because those were the only places where there was any connection to space, really. And because astrobiology didn't exist at the time as something you could study, I had to build my own path towards that. And so I got scholarships to get into University College London in the UK, which had a planetary science program, so a combination of geology and astrophysics. And then I knew later in life I would have to get biology in there somewhere to really create the basis for astrobiology. I didn't really know how to do that yet, but at least I had, a plan. I didn't even think about universities in the US because they were just way too expensive. So at least the British ones, I had some hope of saving up enough money to get in there. So for example, during my high school studies, I had multiple jobs to save every penny for that. And then I got scholarships to get into University College London. And even while in London, I had like three part-time jobs while studying. So that was all hard, and that was basically all just me. But once I got into the university in London, I was suddenly studying something that other people were interested in too. And, I had things in common with my peers, which unfortunately wasn't really the case before that. So I'll just briefly mention, unfortunately, one of the big issues I faced growing up was bullying in school. And so I was many times, a loner, and that was part of the whole isolating thing is that I just never really had people outside of family that supported me, believed in me. And so everything that I did just felt alien because I myself was kind of the alien. But finally at university, suddenly there were like-minded people around me and professors who didn't think my ideas were crazy and ambitions, too out there. And that's when I really started the community building, and that's eventually what it really helped me get through many years of living abroad, facing all sorts of hardships, and trying to, build this almost impossible career from scratch.
Wow, okay. So many interesting points that you brought up. And I have to
Thank
say,
you.
I mean, it was such a difficult and intense path where you basically had to build your own support system, your own path itself. And so were there ever moments where you second guessed your decision to go into this, or were you already very firm in your commitment?
I think, I always was mostly firm, but there were definitely a few moments that really shook me and made me consider giving up. And probably the first time I almost had like a proper breakdown was at the end of my master's degree. And so just to give it a little bit of context, at that point, I had gotten scholarships not only to the UK, but also to Caltech in the US. So again, a scholarship worth a lot of money that I couldn't even imagine at the time. Caltech was considered the best university in the world in my fields at the time. I also got a research grant to work for NASA. I was only 21 years old at the time. So it was all like amazing stuff. But for visa reasons, I had to go back to Europe and couldn't stay in the US for longer. And despite my best efforts, I was running out of money. No matter what I did, I had again multiple jobs while studying, applied for every scholarship I was eligible for in the UK and elsewhere. But being in the US really drained my money a lot. Things were much more expensive in LA during my time at Caltech and NASA JPL. And so I was, you know, at the end of my master's degree, about to reach a huge milestone in my life. But I couldn't afford it. I just couldn't afford to pay for those last few months of my studies and rent. And just no matter what I did, nothing was working. And so I think one night it really got to me because I was just at a point where I just had to figure out a backup plan of like, am I just gonna give up now and have to come back to it later? But where am I gonna live? I didn't want to be homeless. And as a side point, it was kind of ironic when I was working for NASA, I was actually homeless at the same time, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, here I am, just out of options. And that's when it like really hit me. And I was also like in London, it was raining, I was walking home. It was just like, the whole shebang, everything all together. I came home and I was like hyperventilating and just really struggling to figure out what to do next. And that's where part of my brain was like, maybe you should just give up. You're hurting yourself by doing this. But then I think the self-preservation, other part of my mind, my body came in and other thoughts started to come in, reminding me of everything I did so far, everything I've achieved, and how I can't just give up after all this just because of this one, okay, bigger issue. And so luckily those thoughts kind of helped me kind of be able to breathe again. And that then kicked in a kind of problem solving mechanism that my brain is really good at. So something I've nurtured over the years. And so I really was like, okay, I've tried everything I could think of, but the one thing I didn't really do is ask for help. Like I didn't approach other people asking for help. And so I was like, okay, let me, start talking to professors and my fellow other students, and maybe someone will be able to help me. And that was actually my saving grace. I reached out to different professors. One of them told me about a grant that I never heard of before. It's called the Hardship Fund, and it's for people like I was in that situation where, we're excellent students, but for whatever reason, we're just not able to finish our studies. And she told me that I would be more than eligible for that one. And so she got me an appointment with the dean of the university, and she knew all about me and reassured me that it would be all good. And so after reviewing my situation for a few days, they told me that basically they will allocate enough money for me to be able to finish my studies. So that really saved me then. And then I guess that also made me feel better in the future when I faced similar situations of hardship where I felt like I had run out of options, just to remind myself, oh, even that time I thought I ran out of options. And, something else showed up in the end.
Yeah, it feels like this was your path, like you were destined to be on it. No matter what you did, you could not steer off course. But I think you raised such a good point too, which is that there's so many people that outwardly are very successful, but so many battles and things are being faced behind closed doors. And I think you're such a good example of this. And I want to talk more about you speaking about being or experiencing homelessness while you were at NASA. Because again, this is another situation where I think people would be like, oh my gosh, she has it all. She's working at NASA or working with NASA, and this is amazing. And it is, but at the same time, there's so much that goes into that and so many sacrifices that you have to make to be able to get to that point.
Yeah, true, true. That's the thing is like, especially nowadays, people, just see things on social media or, just make assumptions. Oh, that person has it all, like you said, or, in my case, many people assume that I was able to achieve so many things because my parents paid for it or whatever. And like, sorry, salaries in Slovakia are not that even, for the careers my parents had. They were always civil servants and anyway, we had a family to take care of. So I was, for the most part, always on my own. And that's why I do mention these stories and in my even social media posts and things like that, I do try and talk about these hardships, not necessarily to advocate for myself, but more to show others who are also facing hardships that, not alone, you know, even people like me faced similar things, and this is what I learned, or maybe here's some advice that might help you. So I think it's really important that we talk about this side of our life. And so in terms of the NASA experience, yeah, it was again one of those like great ironies in my life. I had worked so hard to get this special research grant to work for NASA, and it was extra difficult to get because at the time international students were not allowed to work for NASA. It was just a rule, and it might still be like that to this day. I'm not sure anymore. Um, So I couldn't apply as a student, but the researcher I was communicating with, he really liked my ideas and my enthusiasm and perseverance that I didn't give up despite all these like bureaucratic issues preventing me from working at NASA. And eventually, after several months of working together to try and yeah, figure out the situation, we came across a grant that I could apply for. And if we were to get it, I could work for NASA as a visiting researcher. So not as a student, but in different capacity, and that would help get around this rule. And luckily it worked out after a lot of effort, and I finally got this amazing job at NASA. It was finally doing astrobiology research for the first time in my life, and it just really felt like a dream come true. But at the same time, I was in a similar situation like the one I just described, where no matter what I did, I was running out of money. And that was because the scholarship I got to get to Caltech was only to pay the tuition fees. It wasn't to cover housing, food, and other expenses. And Caltech is located in Pasadena, which is a very expensive part of Los Angeles. And so again, no matter how much I literally starved myself, I was one of those students that, would show up to an event just to eat the free food because I was so hungry all the time. But yeah, no matter what I did, I was running out of money and there was just no way I could pay for rent. And at first, I tried to stay with friends in their dorms, but even that didn't work out because after a while they were getting in trouble for having a visitor for so long in their dorm and all that. So sadly, over time, I ran out of friends where I could stay, and my only option, apart from literally sleeping on the floor somewhere, hidden away from security guards, was to try couch surfing, and that was a thing at the time. Which I mean, I don't know if I would do it again these days, but back then it was fairly new, and a lot of people were using this option, where through some kind of online portal, you find people that are willing to have someone sleep on their couch or some equivalent for free or, for very little. And that just made travel much easier for a lot of young people. But also, it was, a saving grace for someone like me who just did not have money to pay for rent. And so that's what I did. And it was very scary because you are with complete strangers. And as a young girl alone, it was a big risk to take, but I had no options. And so I would basically sleep with my backpack as my pillow, where I had my laptop and other valuable things, my bag with clothes by my feet, and I just prayed every night that I would make it to the next day without anything bad happening to me. And then in the morning, get up and go work at NASA. It was very surreal.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Okay. What was that defining moment that made this all worth it? Was there like an accomplishment or a moment, maybe it was the NASA project or something that you've worked on where you were like, you know what? Like all of these hardships, they made me who I am today, and this brought me to this end goal, and it's something I'm so incredibly proud of.
Yeah, I think it was mostly the NASA project because I came up with this whole alien hunting astrobiology or space biology, as I called it, as an 8-year-old. And then, boom, not even that many years later, as a 21-year-old, I was able to do actual research for NASA, working directly in a NASA facility. And so, as hard as the whole homelessness thing was, it just felt like I was living my dream, minus the where I was sleeping part, but everything else, I was working in these amazing facilities with researchers that were experts in their fields. They were building the Curiosity rover at the time, and my research was directly related to that. So at the end of my time at NASA JPL, I was actually able to put my signature into Curiosity, which is now on Mars. So, it was like a nice cherry on top of the cake in my time there. And essentially, it was the first time I was properly able to do astrobiology research, something that just seemed completely unimaginable even, before that. And then that also opened doors to so many other opportunities over the years, and I've been working with NASA essentially ever since then, and since then in some shape or form. So it was definitely worth it, but that situation was really hard, and and while I was eventually paid for my time at NASA, it was the bureaucracy that got me into that really bad situation because under this grant that we got, they would only pay me once every 3 months or something like that. So that's why for 3 months I had to be homeless because I just couldn't get a paycheck for my work until, yeah, those 3 months were over. And then finally, when I accumulated enough paychecks to be able to afford rent, I was finally able to be in a better spot. But because of that bureaucracy, it put someone like me in such a really precarious situation.
It can be so frustrating, I think, to see that there's so many people who want to go out and make a difference and contribute to scientific advancement or research that can really move our nation and society as a whole forward. But sometimes, like you said, the bureaucracy is really what gets in the way. So, what advice would you have for someone who's perhaps dealing with that in their corporate setting or any type of like professional way where they're almost losing hope and wondering if it's worth it or they really want to do this thing, but it can be really scary and difficult. And you did it. So I'm wondering, do you have any advice for someone maybe experiencing something similar?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the situation, I would say, because, over the years, I experienced a variety of things, whether, in this case, it was more the bureaucracy that got me into that tight spot. But unfortunately, there were also times where it was, people not treating me fairly, to put it very politely, even to the point in Slovakia where people were um, doing like smear campaigns in the media against me and like very, very unpleasant things. And even actually in the US, a couple of times, places I was employed, I was paid a third of my salary compared to my male colleagues, and I was their supervisor. And so I would say it really depends on the situation. If it's something that it's a bureaucratic matter, that maybe there's some kind of loophole, like, in the case of my NASA grant, they didn't like the fact that I was a student, but if I won a grant and I was a visiting researcher, ooh, magically it works. So sometimes it can be a matter of just some technicality. To give another example, the first time I took part in a simulated Mars mission, it was as part of the first British crew to do a simulated Mars mission. I'm not British, but I was doing my PhD in a British university. I came up with various cool research projects, and they liked both me and my experiences and my research projects, and I made it into the crew. So I think a lot of people would have just never applied, going like, "Oh, well, I'm not British, I can't apply," but I tried anyway, justified why I applied, and it worked out. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes the bureaucracy might put off people, especially women, from what my experience is like a lot of women, we're very thorough. And so we are worried about applying for a job position or an opportunity because, oh, well, we might not meet, 100% of the criteria. Whereas many times other people who are not so qualified apply and still get it anyway. So I think in those situations, kind of like back to my story of my plans, A, B, C, D, F, G, apply anyway, see how it goes. The worst that can happen, they say no. So that's when I think it's, worth pursuing, worth giving it a shot. And if it's ends up being something that makes you happy or, opens doors to you or is positive in some shape or form, then it's worth, pursuing despite difficulties. However, if you end up in a situation where you're really being mistreated, harassed, discriminated against, things like that, then it's better to leave. Um, Time and time again, I found it's just so much better to leave. If, there's some way you can fight against that and get justice, great. But many times, sadly, it's not always possible. And too many people try to endure despite that. But ultimately, I personally found you're just hurting yourself. And it's just so much better to be in a more positive environment. And that's essentially what led me to setting up my own nonprofits. I have one in the US, one in Slovakia. The one in the US is called Extreme Frontiers. And now being my own boss, I get to do, still do research with NASA, but I also get to do educational and outreach activities under my own terms, and things are just so much better than being in toxic work environments.
I think that's really fair. It's funny because I think so often when we're in one of these toxic situations, as women, we're taught you'll figure it out, you'll find a way. But it's not our job. It's really not our job to always
Yeah.
fix, I think, the discrimination and the misogyny that we face. And so I think that's such a valid point as well, that you can only do as much as you can do, and you should never feel bad or guilty for having to like take a step back.
Exactly, exactly.
It's not one person's job to fix like an entire system that's broken. It's a little bit crazy. But sometimes I feel like as women, we think that. Like I think that sometimes I'm like, I could fix it, I could do this. And then I'm like, I'm not Bob the Builder. Like I can take a step back, this is not my job. So I think that's very fair. And I'm glad
I
that you
mean, of course, unless you're like in a position of power as a woman. So, for example, when I was the director of the facility High Seas in Hawaii, it was great because I was finally able to change the way we recruited analog astronauts. Before my time, unfortunately, too many times it was just restricted, for example, to US nationals, or there was a preference for usually men and of certain fields. And sadly, it was basically always the same kinds of people over and over again. So my goal as the director was to change that and to make this facility as accessible as possible. And so I would do like blind selection to some degree, where, for example, I didn't know the gender or race or anything about the candidates. I was really looking at their qualifications, and that helped remove any, potential bias. I myself try to be as open-minded as possible, but sometimes, unfortunately, we have these things that are ingrained in us that we're not even aware of. So I was trying to be as fair as possible, and I'm very happy to share that by the end of my time at High Seas, it would be over 60% of the candidates would be women that became analog astronauts. The different minority groups increased substantially. And I think in big part it was because of representation. They saw other people like them became analog astronauts, worked on cool space projects, and it gave them the confidence to apply as well. And so by the end of it, I had a really diverse group of people I worked with, and I was very happy with that, and so glad it created these opportunities for these people. So sometimes it is possible if you have enough power or have a job position that allows you to do that, you can make changes for the good. But even in those situations, your personal situation might not be the best. And that's when you have to make the decision is like, okay, you can continue helping other people, but if it's hurting you, even then you might unfortunately have to step away.
Definitely. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think to wrap up, what I want to ask you as a final thought is of all the places and environments that you've explored, which one changed you the most as a human being?
Oh, wow, that's a really difficult question. So I've been, fortunate enough to have gone to all seven continents, and I did work in all sorts of environments with so many amazing people. So it's hard to say, but I think the places that left the strongest impression on me were places where I worked with communities of people that had so little in life. And despite that, they were generous and welcoming and, just didn't have a lot of these biases or I guess, I don't know, weird conditions that maybe a lot of us from the Western world might have. And it was just really humbling and just amazing to see how people, even with so little, can find so much joy and meaning in life. And that was very eye-opening and just a wonderful new perspective on life.
I love that. Okay. Well, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for sharing your story with us. I think it brings a lot of hope and inspiration for women.
Thank
And
you.
you're such a proud ambassador of the Slovak community. And I think that's also really incredible. So I'm really happy that we got the chance to chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Okay. And is there anything else you want to tell the people before we close out the interview? Anything you want to mention? Anything you're excited about?
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention briefly, that even though I had to leave my country to pursue my dreams and passions, I'm very glad that I was able to find ways to come back later in life. And, like I mentioned earlier, I helped contribute to Slovakia becoming a member of the European Space Agency, brought the first space engineering degree program back home, started several space startups, which now led to over 60 being present in Slovakia. And so, despite still having a base abroad, I always try and bring something back home so that other people won't have to leave like I did back then. And also, I just find it very fulfilling to be able to do outreach and educational work there. There's just so much talent and potential back home. And I wouldn't want people to feel like, oh, just because we're from a small country, we can't achieve great things.
Definitely. Well, you're already proof of that. So I'm excited to see everybody
Thank
else that
you.
comes out of Slovakia. And you mentioned such a good point. We are like the most hardworking people. And the same thing for me, where like my parents are such strong role models. So love that. Excited for everything that's to come and can't wait to keep up with your journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.